This one's going to be really exciting. I'm going to start off, first of all, with giving just a quick intro to the title. And we're going to be talking today about how do we fix disinformation, the disinformation crisis in digital media. Today, we're lucky to have Sarah Evans of Seven Strategy. She is going to be our moderator today. And what's amazing about this is Sarah has at least one, maybe two kids around her, and she is going to perform like online webinar magic by actually moderating this panel with our guests, as well as trying to manage the little ones that are near her. This is what you could only get if we were in a pandemic and having to accommodate for this world. I can't wait to see or hear you, Sarah, and then see and hear your kids. Thanks so much for helping us out today.
Thanks for having me, Lee.
So why don't you, Sarah, you want to do some quick intros and then we'll dive right in. And I'm going to set a timer for how many minutes it is before, one of your kids comes up and asks for help on a math problem.
Okay, 6 months ago, I wouldn't have been comfortable with all of this. This is just the lay of the land now. And I am excited to have these opportunities because as an adult, I still love to learn. And I really treat the Tuesdays with Turbine as my opportunity to get some free education and knowledge from industry experts. Of course, like you, Lee, founder and CEO of Turbine Labs, Michael Ginn, former CNN executive and CEO of Ginn Management, and Michael Casey, who it is an honor and privilege to meet, Chief Content Officer at CoinDesk and co-founder of the Streambed. So thank you all for being here. And we're going to jump right in so we can hear your voices focused on how are we fixing disinformation, because it really is another sort of epidemic that is happening. And I want to jump in with something really important. And this concept of fake news, it's a term even my 9-year-old knows. This is something we're used to hearing. How has this become mainstream? What happened? What went wrong? How did we get here?
Michael, let's start out with you.
No big deal.
Yeah.
How did we get here? Well, I think we made a deal with the devil with the way that social media was rolled out in the moment that Facebook and others came along. And the way I think about it is like, the internet was created as this distributed, decentralized ideal. And when it comes to the actual architecture of that, the packet switching model, the protocols that were built, it was a phenomenally, groundbreaking idea. And it truly was with that spirit in mind. It was actually, as we all know, a defense contract that led to it. And the idea was to create a resilient system that wouldn't have centralized bodies in the middle of it that could be attacked, so that information would be preserved by having a distributed system. And that worked. But what we didn't figure out is how do we deal with the economics of the internet? And the economics of the internet were like, okay, this data, this information we're sharing is actually valuable. We haven't figured out how to actually monetize it, but we're going to have to figure out how to actually transfer that. And we don't have money in the internet world. So this is actually a pitch for Bitcoin, which I'm not going to go into. But like people think it's Bitcoin.
We're going to go into that later, Michael.
Right, but the point was that you didn't have the money. And you didn't have the mechanism for actually establishing that value. So the only way to do it was to create these sort of large network effects of communities and then to monetize it through advertising. And so centralized control of those communities, which was founded on an algorithmic model that allowed those platforms to essentially monetize it by manipulating that data and then repackaging that to advertisers, became the sort of the fundamental system around which we then started to absorb and share information. And what that meant, I mean, if any of you've read, a brilliant, very important book, Shoshana Zuboff's book, The Age of Surveillance Capitalism,
yeah,
it takes us through this and shows how essentially, we gave up an enormous amount of control. This data is ours, and we've handed it to them, and we don't. And the thing is, it's a black box that they control. That then, it essentially sort of manipulates it. And what's happened is that algorithm acting in the service of Facebook and Google, and therefore to provide valuable audience curation capacity to their advertisers was then basically, harnessed, appropriated, if you like, by these disinformation machines. And with the advent of bots and AI and everything else, it has just become very, very hard to control. So I don't know. We need to figure out the economics and a model that allows us to create a different economic model. And that's where we're stuck.
Yeah. Michael, I want to let you know, I actually keep that book. Let's see, right there.
Oh, you do? Excellent. Guys, one second. If Sarah has problems with kids in the pandemic, something has just come up in my house that I'm going to have to deal with.
Go ahead.
I'm really sorry. I didn't expect this happening right now. But
let's okay. You take a pause. And we're gonna keep talking, Michael.
Keep talking. I'll be as fast as I can.
We're in a pandemic, and by the way, I'll fill that up. Keep going, Michael. We'll ready.
Thanks a lot.
And Lee, are there any people more comfortable than dealing with life emergencies? I think we've all had our fair share. I know. I'd love for you to talk about fake news as well, simply because of the very nature of what Turbine Labs does. And we talk about this access to intelligence, and it's something that's important to me. Well, that intelligence is coming from media sources, and it's coming from social media. So you obviously have to be smarter than, what is established as fake news. How do you deal with that?
This is a great question, and it actually dovetails into the comment that Michael was stating. And one of the key issues that has caused the ability for fake news to be proliferated and amplified so easily goes back to the nature of a sort of a streaming platform of content. So if you think about how Twitter's set up and how Instagram and all the major social networks are sort of this, vertically oriented, keep you engaged in the platform, keep it on by getting your finger to do sort of this thing, scrolling up. And as we all know, there may be an end to the internet, but there's no end to scrolling. That the way that social media platforms keep you engaged is by continually having that physical engagement of scrolling through content. And that formatting lends itself to how people post, right? So if you think about a tweet and it's a certain number of characters and you move on to the next thing. If you think about a Facebook post or even a TikTok video or a snap or anything like that, it is a single item of content that is designed to keep your attention for a period of time. And what's happened is the job of a social network is to keep you engaged and to have you focused for a brief moment on a single piece of content. And that really lends itself to something like an article. And if you consume content out on the internet and it happens to map to your personal beliefs and affirmations, and you say, oh, I believe that, I've connected with that, I'm going to share that with my friends and networks so that they see it too. And as it turns out, we tend to hide, or we tend to not hide, but we tend to cluster in tribes. And so if I share something with my network of, I think it's the average of 130 friends or followers that we have on these social networks, that the likelihood of those individuals agreeing with my perceptions and my affirmations, they'll share it too. And Michael's going to go much more into the algorithms of how this works, but that's really where it all starts. So if I am unsatisfied with normal channels of news, I believe that there are big corporations that are running, the major news networks and the major publications. And so I go and I try and find some alternative press, and maybe the alternative press doesn't do it for me. So I go find fringe press that is more sensationalized and doesn't have fact checking like traditional news organizations. I can have an enormous amount of influence on those publications that will just sit there and write because they know it connects with me. I share it to a social network. Now that's to 130 people. The social networks know that those people agree with me, and on we go. So Michael, are you good?
I was listening. Yeah, it's since we're being frank about our scenario here, this is my bandwidth problem that Michael and I've been talking about. And the electrician that was supposed to fix something has turned up in the middle of this whole thing. So he's off camera, but he's fiddling with a live Ethernet cord that is not actually. I'm using Wi-Fi, so we should be fine. But anyway, that's just to give you that. I was kind of because you were talking. So it's
Michael. I want to tell you, this is one of the beautiful things we'll remember about 2020 is that this crap happens to all of us.
Right.
And 6 months ago, we would have been embarrassed, or if you didn't have the mute on and you were trying to be on a conference call and the toilet flushes, everyone would have been horrified 6 months ago. Yeah. And now it's just Wednesday or Tuesday.
Right. It's just that it had to happen now. So anyway, I was listening into some of that, and I think you're absolutely on the right track there, Lee. This liked audience concept. This, it also feeds into this bigger problem in addition to disinformation, which I think is completely related problem of, the echo chambers that we've created for ourselves, right? So that these algorithms have pushed us into communities of people who think the same, and and our confirmation bias is constantly being, reaffirmed by the same flow of information that tells me, yes, this is the way I see the world, as opposed to, those crazy people over there on the right or the left, right? And that becomes, something that's very easy to manipulate. That's part of the problem.
One of the things I wanted to take a quick step back on is we're going to dig obviously more into technology and AI and other tech opportunities, but also this concept of being good stewards of information and news when we as consumers are sharing information. How can we vet, verify, or look for credible sources of news and information before we even get to the step, Lee, you're talking about sharing it with our 130 people in our circle?
Yeah.
What should we do before we even hit share?
That's a great question. Let me step back 1 second to just dovetail into something that Michael said, and then I'll answer that question because I think they go together nicely. So if you look at what Michael was describing as sort of the beginning of the internet, right, starts in the 80s. I think it was actually even earlier than that. It's this DARPA project that's just connecting these wires between large servers between universities. And really in 1993, 1994, Michael, the public internet and the ability to access it through a browser starts to become available, and it's a very mechanical thing. I wish we had a screenshot of what the original Yahoo looked like. It's not pretty, but what the beautiful thing about that is that the original internet went into sort of the mechanics, the inhumaneness of just connecting server clusters together. And what happened because of the availability of bandwidth and really innovation that came from the United States was that people were able to tap into our physiological and our behavioral natures. Mm-hmm. And that was not part of the cogs of the internet when we started out. It's very, again, go back to like Yahoo. There's nothing human about the original Yahoo. But there's something very, very emotional about logging into Facebook or Snapchat or TikTok now. And so when you take the mechanics of the internet and then you add in behavioral science and what causes us to feel love and what causes us to feel anger and what causes us to feel, vitriol and all of the other emotions, and then you design algorithms around them, that becomes a much more powerful thing that the human brain's not ready for, which goes into my point about how do you detect. And what you have to understand about how social networks work is that a lot of people are accessing this content and they don't want the truth. They want content that confirms their own emotions and bias. And so the first thing that you want to have when you're trying to decide what is real and what's not real is, do you have it in you to say, I wonder if this is real? I can see a picture of a flying saucer, right? That's, and that somebody's doctored. And if I want to believe that UFOs are real, I'm going to say aliens have landed, or that that I'll look at it through a critical eye and I'll say, I appreciate that picture is there, but I need to have more information. And so we have to teach critical thinking to have people start asking more questions. And a lot of people have just gotten very comfortable in giant reclinable couches with back massagers and cup holders. And they say, I just want the content that's in front of me, and I don't want to have to stand up to go get a new beer. I want to open the fridge on my couch. So
get uncomfortable.
And I'm comfortable.
Yeah, make everybody uncomfortable. That'd be the answer.
And so the only way that you start this process is to say, I'm willing to be uncomfortable. I'm willing to question what I'm watching because I'm aware that there are so many different ways that the news can be delivered to me. Okay, so if you're willing to question that this is real or not, you always should start out with its source. If somebody shared it with me on a social network, it always raises a red flag. I tend to believe pictures of my friends' kids because there's authenticity there, although I guess we could manipulate those. But if it relates to text or about events, I've trained my own brain to say, I need to get more information on that. And then we really have to start to have people say, I'm not just going to believe CNN. I'm not just going to believe Fox. I'm not going to believe the Federalist. I'm not going to believe, Daily Costs. That I'm going to start to see an aggregation of center points that come from reputable news sources. Michael, I mean, that was a big diatribe, but
yeah, no, I think it's very real. I think it's also very interesting that and then when you say Michael, you want Michael Ginn or Michael Casey here?
Well, Michael Casey, I see Michael Ginn more than I see you, Michael Casey.
Okay.
I'll get my time.
You'll get your time. Good. I'm looking forward to hearing you comment. But it's an interesting time to be thinking about this, right? Because I think like never before in the aftermath of the Black Lives Matter protest and everything, people are for the first time starting to have to really understand what bias is. And I think my company, for example, we've had some very serious conversations about are we biased? And the answer is we are, right? We are racially biased.
Yep.
Like, racism is ingrained in all of us, right?
Yep.
And that's something that for the first time, I think, for many people, like, oh my God, this is real. So there's actually an interesting conversation that I think would be interesting to see how you would extend it to say, look, this isn't just about racism. It's about every aspect of what we do. Like, we are biased all the time. So in the light of that, I think one of the things that's also very important is for mainstream media to recognize that bias, right? I think one of the things that's actually been very unhelpful, and believe me, I mean, Michael knows my politics. I do think there's a bad team and a good team in what's sort of happening in terms of the news at the moment. That said, I think CNN is doing a terrible job of perpetuating the assumptions of those that don't believe it, that there's a conspiracy out there, right? Because it holds itself up as being, look, we are telling the facts. Donald Trump is telling lies nonstop. And we are just drilling down on top of that and saying, he's lying, here's the truth. He's lying, here's the truth. He's lying, here's the truth. The reality is it's fuzzier than that, right? Because everything has got bias in it. And journalists don't do a very good job of admitting that. I've always thought that journalists should, and I've been one for 25 years, understand that we cannot be objective. It just literally is impossible. And that if that conversation can be advanced by all media, it actually will serve the broader good, because it will create less of an excuse for the conspiracy theorists to dismiss mainstream media and seek out their crazy conspiracy alternatives. If everybody is understanding that that's what it is, and that like, look, we're all biased. We're trying to fight against that bias. We do this and that to try to constrain it. But you understand it, and there's a sort of an honest subjectivity to what you're doing. I think we can start to have a more complicated or complex, but richer and constructive dialogue around these issues.
Michael Ginn.
Well, you guys are very smart, very articulate. I'm going to just take a couple of pieces and run with them. And then I'm going to also bring it into last night and what transpired in my world, from 10:40 Eastern time through moments ago. So first of all, we mentioned platforms. We mentioned YouTube and Google. I mean, from a business perspective, from a truly commercial standpoint, you only have really two huge winners right now. and that is Google and Facebook in the commercial world. We can throw Twitter in there from an influence world, but it doesn't quite have the same business model. And everyone else that we count on for our journalism product is struggling to find a model that works. I think that, we looked at the print industry over the last decade has been looking for what's their floor and to build up from there, and they haven't found the floor yet. It keeps dropping. And the same thing is happening with broadcast and cable. It keeps dropping, with the exception of Facebook and Google. And, and people looked at TikTok as having that same sort of engagement. They're platforms, they're playing in a different world. So all the other content creators that actually feed those platforms, and those content creators could be the New York Times, or it could be our kids producing videos. They don't necessarily have a business model that's working right now. And so, how do you solve these fundamental problems when you don't have a business model moving forward? When you're counting at some point in time that things are going to level off and you're going to start to be able to build things back up again. I mean, that's one of the fundamental, it's the sieve problem. You're still going to the bottom. And then from this takes into account whether we want to call it bias or platform use. I watched Michelle Obama's speech live last night. Literally 30 seconds after she finished her speech, there were parts of that content that I found on Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube. Some of it was taken out of context. Some of it was straight as she had said it. Some had been converted into memes. But all of it had been twisted to satisfy those tribes that we talk about, and so, and then I go back to the basic fundamentals. Who actually owns that content from last night? I mean, is it the DNC that owns that content? When we get into the provenance conversation, is it the DNC's responsibility to make sure that content is controlled and monitored? And we get into the whole discussion of the commercial use of that content after she's delivered her speech, or is that CNN content, or because they ran on CNN, and that's also a complicated story. So that's my salvo into the conversation.
I want to offer up a little bit of a digression, Michael. Again, Fox News's business model is working really, really well. Their ratings are completely off the charts. Their profitability is off the charts, and I think what's very interesting about the notion of bias. First of all, it's in some ways it's the wrong word to use. Michael Casey, you were exactly right. Every human is biased. We're biased by the experiences that we have from the first light we saw, wherever we were, brought into this world, all the way through, every ounce of, emotion and language that comes into your brain. That forms who we are. And so when you hear the notion of the New York Times editorial is biased or Sean Hannity is biased. Well, of course they are. They're people generating this content. And so it's a false argument to say who's biased and who's not biased. The thing that disappoints me is that we're using this as an excuse to say bias is something I disagree with, and therefore I won't consume that content. Right. So I watched all 4 channels last night of the DNC. I will do the exact same thing next week for the RNC. I thought to myself as I was watching DNC content on Fox News last night, and each senator, Bernie Sanders, Michelle Obama, are all coming on. And the same thing is going to happen in reverse next week. That do we keep the attention of somebody who thinks that there's bias because they're hearing a perspective that they disagree with? And so one of the things, this goes back into Sarah's question, that we have to start teaching people is, to your point, Michael, that bias is okay. We all have it. We all have our confirmations and things like that. Let's talk about perspectives. I've got great friends who are conservatives from an economic policy perspective, right? There are classical conservatives that are left. And it's not even something that it's a rare sighting of a species. There are people who are thoughtful and they don't want to participate in the bashing of the other side. They have a philosophy, of how a country should be run and how decisions should be made. And those people deserve to be able to get information that, one, helps them get better education on their point of view, but also should help them understand opposing points of view. And the left has to do the exact same thing. The problem with what Google has done and what Facebook has done is that they have made the wall stronger between intellectual liberals and intellectual conservatives and fundamentalist religious people and all the people that make up the melting pot of the United States, which should be, by the way, the leading example of freedom of information, even though it's not. How do they get safely out of their bubbles where they can confirm what they want, get smarter, and then also have opposing points of view in the same day without it turning into memes, Michael, like you just mentioned. So I think about this from the perspective of both sides, and I think I would be really frustrated if I were an ideological conservative, not somebody who is, again, into spreading misinformation or conspiracy theories, just conservative, economic and socially. And then you start to understand why Fox News is the only publisher that's crushing it right now.
Well, interestingly, Fox News, there's an interesting analysis that put it out, said, like, because to Michael's point about whether these business models are working, I would argue that some of the, mainstream, let's call them liberal, whatever, publications are also, the business model is starting to come back, and it's a pay model, right? So, subscriptions are booming at the New York Times, Washington Post, and a bunch of others, and the Wall Street Journal, which of course is conservative, but doesn't really get, it's my old employer, so I'm going to speak differently of it, but it's certainly not like Fox, right? But it's trustable mainstream media that does real journalism is behind a paywall, and Fox, which, look, I mean, it's not just about an intellectual bias, it is deliberate misinformation, and that is the key. So
there's an absolute difference. That's
but a caveat on what I was saying before is, I mean, yes, we're all biased, right? But there's a difference between your bias and your deliberate act of misinformation.
Completely agree.
And I know this from a personal experience because I used to be on Fox itself. And one of the anchors that I was on once stopped me as I was going into the elevator. We were in the same building, the Wall Street Journal and Fox. And she said, "We love having you on the show, Michael, because you're the only one that tells the truth." And that just depressed me to know that the other performers on this panel that I was on were there to, create just rubbish.
Well, you bring up a really good point that people ask me, and Sarah, I keep coming back to your question because I think we're the conversation's about disinformation also, and I bet Sarah would want to have a question here at some point in time in the future. But when somebody asks me, how do you believe a news organization? And again, this is a lot of stuff that consumers have to do, and I don't know if we're ready yet to do this because, again, we like sitting in big, comfy couches with fridges in them. We don't want to have to do anything. But the other thing that I ask is, how does somebody pay their talent? If you look at the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times and the Washington Post, there's conservative paper, Financial Times, just pick the journalistic organization. And you say, is there 80% of the salaries going to 20% of the talent, and vice versa? So if you look at CNN, MSNBC, and Fox News, they invest huge amounts of money in their opinion journalism talents. The Handys, the Ingrams, the Lemons, the Cuomos, and so these people are making $5 to $30 million a year to go stir stuff up. I don't think Maggie Haberman makes $30 million a year. I mean, I've sort of seen documentaries about. Most people will not know who that is,
right.
And so if you want to understand who's investing in actually trying to get facts, they're probably not paid nearly as well as Anderson Cooper.
That's a good point.
And so yeah.
Well, Lee, what you're touching on does kind of dig into what I wanted to get back to on the tech side of things. And it's something Michael Casey has talked about publicly, in that digital media needs a public index. And if we start to look at this financial discrepancy of folks, then there needs to be something to neutralize the field in some ways. So if as in Michael's words, if it's time to deplatform the platforms, what does that mean? What does that look like? And how can we take what's actually happening, use tech, and get to a place where that's the case?
Great. I take it that's a question for me. Thanks, Sarah. Yes, I think that this is actually, I think, is we can actually marry this part of the conversation with the one we were just having before, right? Because I don't think there was ever a solution that is possible without some level of human education, and it's our choice, right? People will have to make choices, but I think that what we can do with a bunch of new technologies, if we come up with standards that everybody accedes to and agrees that this is the way to go forward, we can create tools which make it easier for people to make those correct decisions about whether or not they're going to reshare something that's just their bias, or whether they're going to believe something that's being thrown at them across social media. And it comes down to this keyword of provenance, or sometimes it's called providence, sometimes provenance. It kind of means more or less the same thing. And it is this idea of the origin of where something came from. And it's a key concept in supply chains. It's a key concept. It should be a key concept in digital media supply chains, which are far more complex than physical goods supply chains, because in the digital world, things don't I don't take a bunch of screws and boxes, 4x2s, make something of it, and then give that new thing to you and relinquish control of what I previously had. In digital media, as we all know, we just make a copy and send it somewhere else, right? So it's a very different concept. But how do we, in this world where there is no such thing as digital scarcity, there's no such thing as a digital property, how do we, on the other hand, still create that provenance? And I think it is there is blockchain technology can play a key role here. My company, Streambed Media, is working with something called the Open Index Protocol. The Open Index Protocol is a metadata organizing protocol that takes in information about content and then logs it into a blockchain. And blockchain, of course, is a distributed system that cannot be changed to keep a time-stamped record of transactions. In this case, the transactions are recording information. It's not sending Bitcoin per se. It's literally the act of transacting with data. So
and I think a lot of people confuse that. If they know what blockchain is and they know what Bitcoin is, they interchange them. But you're really talking about two different things. And
yes and no. And here's why the no is important. What is money? Money is information, right? Money is a means by which I'm actually communicating to somebody else that I am relinquishing control of a claim worth of some value of data. It's the information in a ledger, right? So the way I like to think about it is what is the currency of the internet? It's actually data, because I'm paying every time I'm looking at Facebook, but I'm just not paying in the way that I'm paying by giving all the time. And Shoshana Zuboff has explained a very powerful form of money, essentially, right? So if you start with that as a concept, right? Just think that the biggest challenge keeping track of our transactions is when there is something of value in that transaction, whether it's money or data, how do I track it? How do I make sure that I'm not lying about it, that I'm not double spending, that I'm sending the same information to you and quietly sending it to somebody else? That's what a blockchain does, right? It gives us that sequence of events that say this is what happened, and you can't go back and change it because it's going to cost you an enormous amount of money to do so. And there's nobody in charge of it, and that's what's critical, because if there's somebody in charge, they could actually go ahead and do it, right? So we're treating it, therefore, as, yes, a recording device for information changes, but it takes a leap of logic, but you can get there and think those are transactions. They are transfers of value. They just happen to be data as value, right? So the blockchain is that's what it is. It's a record-keeping device, changes of state. And we're using it for this purpose to keep track of, all right, at this moment in time, Michael Casey made this video, uploaded it, and attested to the fact that he owns it. And here's the metadata associated with it, everything else, and that gets recorded. And now that's a starting point. And if you then create tools like Streambeds and others that are being created that then build on top of that and say, hey, if you're going to do something with this down the road, you're going to republish this. Here are the terms around which you can do so, the smart contracts and so forth. And yeah, if you change it, it will log that, and you'll see and have this record of provenance of where it came from. You're not actually sort of transferring a good, but the instances in which it changes are going to be there. Now, you need a lot of different pieces to come together. We'll need the platforms to cooperate. We need people to start using these tools.
Right.
But when it comes to that bigger question about how do we build these tools to enable people to make decisions, there's a movement. I'm involved with a group called the Deep Trust Alliance. It's a very interesting group you guys should all look at. Founded by Catherine Harrison, formerly of IBM. And yeah, and they're working to say, okay, so that's one piece of the puzzle, the provenance, right? But other ones like, tools like AI that can be basically applied to, say, a video and says, and it can recognize the changes, right? And show that against this standard, which was the very first instance of the file that's recorded in a blockchain, there's now this change has happened. And that may or may not have been authorized by the contract that was struck to that original contract or not. And then what happens is, this is the way I think we're imagining it, at some point, media will carry this, if you like, or the little, lockbox for SSL certificates to say, this is something that is consistent with what the original creator's contract said it could do. It's under the terms of that, and this is not. You can watch it, you can decide whether you believe it or not, but understand that this provenance question is different in this case than that. And those sorts of tools, I think, along with, education and everything else, and as I say, kind of a different approach and mindset from mainstream media itself, will hopefully come together and allow us to start to think about how do we actually absorb and share and use information, otherwise very decentralized and chaotic system that we currently have.
So, Michael, in 2018, you published a book called The Truth Machine, The Blockchain and the Future of Everything, which everyone should go check out. I'm waiting for the signed version before it goes onto my...
okay, you need the signed one. I'll get you that.
Shelf. But one of the... I'll put will you put my book when I'll get around to it in 5 or 6 years, but I want it on that stack. But we got a question from the audience, and I think it maps to how we talk about truth and verification. So our guest said when we were talking about Fox News and opinion journalism and really opinion journalism that happens primarily between I'm in Colorado, so the 7 and 10 o'clock hour, no matter what you're watching on cable news, because that's where the money comes in. But it says that this person's basically inferring that the content is disingenuous because they are orienting content for partisan aims rather than informing aims. And so how does the blockchain, again, this is going to be a kind of a curveball question, but can it help us also identify sort of the purpose for which we are consuming the data? In other words, this person's exactly right. Just because it's partisan doesn't mean it's not true until it becomes false on both sides. However, can we create sort of like a purity channel of facts? And I think that's what the blockchain aims to do, data writ large. But what is it when it comes down to sort of things that are informing us about what's happening in the world? Where I know we can get authenticity, but I don't know if we can get distinguish facts from something that is partisan purposefully.
Absolutely. I mean, I also the very notion of truth is itself a relative kind of subjective concept, right? So I would. And first of all, it's interesting because the title of the book, The Truth Machine, was a bit provocative, and people would come back to this. Say, this is rubbish. The blockchain it's just a recording device of attestations of information. You can put as many lies as you want in that blockchain, and now have an immutable record of lies. And to which I say absolutely true. But what we're getting at with this concept of truth is something that is, how that record, that sequence of transactions. It's a machine that allows us to arrive at a consensus that agrees on what they are. And in fact, there is so much about our world that isn't black and white, right? So I often say to people, tell me, what is the absolute to the cent number of the US GDP? What is it? Could anybody ever find it? Could you literally at any given time find? Of course you couldn't, right? But yet we always cite a number that's this, that, right?
Sure.
These are estimates, and they are estimates that we all form a consensus around, and that consensus is either believed or it's not. I lived in Argentina. The statistics agency became corrupted, and it was just sending out literal lies. We don't feel that way necessarily about the Bureau of Economic Statistics in the United States. Maybe one day we will. But
right.
The thing is that that's a consensus, and what is powerful about the blockchain is it allows us to form a consensus around. So there's it's understood that this is the shared record. We believe this is what happened. Again, the information in there might be a lie, but we recognize the sequence. So what can we do with this in terms of news? I think we just have to literally recognize that the fact question isn't necessarily solved by this, right? Because again, you can have lies in there. There's some interesting ways you can sort of go to the very root of what the basis of that data, what that attestation or that claim is being made, and maybe run that data through a blockchain. There's layers of all this. But at the end of the day, I think that we just, and I think it's really important from a First Amendment perspective as well to just say, look, we're not going to build a system that censors. It says you can say this, or that. But what I think is really important is, there's this question about how do I know whether something is being manipulated or not, maybe for partisan reasons or not. We need to start thinking about the distribution system, and what is the incentive behind it. We talked before about the algorithms that are doing this, but there's also bots, right? So another book I wrote was called The Social Organism with Oliver Luckett, and this, we looked at the distribution network that is the internet now, and how in fact it's not really about physical wires. It's the stuff you were talking before about, Lee. It's our emotions, and therefore, if we accept that the means by which information transpires and is shared around the world is through these kind of emotional human connections, I think we should be able to build systems that can measure what is a real human connection and what's not. And one way in which a blockchain might be useful in this is that, what a blockchain does is it says it puts a price on doing things. So, and it's built like the original idea of Bitcoin, this proof of work model that charges you money in terms of energy to actually record things. And then if you were to go back and do it, you'd have to spend a massive amount of money. It was built on something called Hashcash, and Hashcash was built on the idea that if I want to send spam emails, I have to send a tiny amount. I have to use a tiny amount of electricity for each individual email, and it's nothing to send one email to you, Lee. But if I want to send 1 million of these things, it's going to cost me a lot of money, right? Yeah. So I think we could build something similar around bot networks and follower networks and things like that. That we could sort of have systems that would just say, all right, this information has come to you by way of a network that is filled with massive amounts of proven false connections. This is not a real distribution network. And maybe we could even regulate that, because it's not a question of censorship in that sense. Because we're not censoring the information. We're making a judgment out, is this a utility? Is this a distribution system? And I think that if we get our heads around the idea that distribution is an emotional concept, not a physical one, then we can start to say, all right, what tools can we bring to bear into all of this that might allow us to make these decisions without actually censoring the information itself?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I think it's very important that we don't sort of have either algorithmic or human-based systems that can censor this stuff. I think we do need to have an open network. I'm interested in. I don't sympathize that much with the anger. I don't like Facebook's business model. I hate the way it enables disinformation, but I'm not really all that comfortable with having these platforms, basically decide what I should and shouldn't read. I think
obviously this is a huge topic. I mean, how do we fix disinformation crisis is going to be far outside what we get to talk about today. But the most important thing is that we are talking about it, right? Getting the conversation started, and we use this as an opportunity to keep this as a focus in everything that we do. So if you had to think of fixing in terms of just getting started, how do we start the process of identifying this as a crisis, bringing visibility to it? If you each had to offer 1 to 2 pieces of advice for how do we fix this right now in digital media, what would be your sound bites? And if we can start with you, Lee, and then Michael Ginn, and end with Michael Casey.
Yeah, this is a great question. I mean, for us, we launched, Turbine Labs launched a news site in May called the Neutral, and we're not looking at this purely from a technology standpoint that a blockchain would be looking at for verification of accuracy or validity of any concept you could think of. And from that perspective, the blockchain is, I think we're just scratching the surface on its potential. We're looking at it more of how do we start to change human behavior. And what we realized, I'll just spend 2 seconds on sort of the neutral business concept, or not business concept because it's a free website, but that we tell stories by having journalists that are not bots or robots give basic facts around a topic. The first night of the DNC was last night. It doesn't matter where you are in the spectrum of the media, no one can dispute that. We all saw that was a factual thing. You don't need to agree with a single speaker that happened, but the fact is that it did happen. And then when we look at how reporting happens, and this is not opinion reporting, this is just journalism in all of its forms, by bringing together articles that have counterpoint or opposing perspectives as it relates to reporting. Again, we don't put any content from opinion sections because you can say whatever you want, but just how are things reported so that readers can see how journalists and media organizations manipulate even how they write sentences to train your brain into a certain area. That's what we're trying to expose there. And what we've learned is that we have a masthead problem, that there is certain content that people will not expose them to because of what it says on the top of the web page or of the newspaper. And if you took away the masthead and you just presented content to somebody who is either ardent left-leaning person or ardent right-leaning person, and you just put an article in front of them, you didn't tell them where it came from, and you said, what do you think of the believability of this article? You would probably get a lot more agreement than you imagine. In fact, we're seeing this already. Now, the second that you say, do you realize that came from the Wall Street Journal? Or do you see that came from Fox News? You see that came from the New York Times? You see that came from NBC News? It's almost as if it was a blasphemy. And so news organizations have to recognize that they have a masthead problem and start to think about how to draw people into the public square. And it's going to take a long, long time because these perceptions are now very, very deeply seated. So our advice is get content from multiple sources and stop looking at the masthead and ask yourself whether or not you agree with the printed text rather than the place where it comes from to make decisions on what is factual. And it obviously has to come from a blend. As Michael was speaking about, the truth actually generally lies in the middle of the aggregation of data.
Yeah. Good stuff.
So I'm gonna give and I don't mean this to be the snarky response up front, but I'm gonna tell you it is what it is, for the foreseeable future.
It is.
Yep. And there's no way around it.
Yep.
Longer term, there's a lot to wrestle with here. I mean, I don't think that we can underestimate the power of the platforms. And I don't believe that regulation is a solution of the platforms. But, content distribution, particularly since we're in a mobile-first world, is just dominated by a handful of platforms that have no current incentive to change what they're doing. We look at the Facebook ad boycott that basically Facebook said, we don't really care because you big companies are no longer our core clients. We make most of our money off of all these tiny businesses that pay us because we're really cheap. And so boycott all you want, you're just hurting yourself. So, I would love to be able to answer, and I actually would like to see this to be part of the answers. I'd like to see the major brands and corporations step up in support of quality journalism. I don't know if the numbers are there to make it a good business decision. It may be a good moral decision. But I like a lot of what Michael talks about from a blockchain solution. And I do think there's a longer landscape on a longer time frame on anything being implemented. But the key thing that I like about that is it ultimately eliminates censorship moving forward, and it decentralizes control of content. But it still seems to me to be years off where we're into any sort of decentralized, internet solution with blockchain being the primary method of distribution of content. And so, I hate to say it, but for the time being, we have to self-police ourselves. I mean, I think we have to look in the mirror. I think we have to have honest conversations with our peers and our friends and try to find some middle ground where we're just not skewed so much more towards the actual opinion side of things, because I don't think there's a business solution in the short term. It is what it is.
So I'm gonna meet you guys in the middle, because or at least take a piece from both of you, whether in the middle or not. But I agree and disagree with what you're saying about the time frame here, Michael, because yes, something where we are going to have decentralized social media systems where we are all collectively part of some communal gathering that has no company in charge is a utopia that I would like to live in, but it's a long time to get coming. But what we're getting at is like just having publishers start to agree that they need to create some sort of open indexing system, some reliable index upon which we can then build these trails. I think that's actually closer. I mean, we're obviously, the other company do, and companies, like CoinDesk that I'm involved with is experimenting with that. We've had conversations with the New York Times about this. So there's really, there are people who are thinking hard about this, but what it does require, I think, and this is partly to your point, Lee, right? I think we need these publishers to come together and recognize that they have a shared interest in the sort of in the accuracy of the information, that we all go down together unless we all find and meet a standard. The challenge, though, is like I love what you were saying about the masthead and that risk, but from the business model perspective, what do I do if I want the New York Times? I'm the New York Times. I want my news to beat the Washington Post. How do I win if what the consumer's getting doesn't even have that differentiation?
And that's as soon as you mentioned that, Michael, my thought went back to the Pentagon Papers and how the scoop around who had the information, who published it first. Take the Pentagon Papers, take Watergate, and these desperate battles between the New York Times and the Washington Post, because they viewed their very survival off of being able to get the word to the printer before the presses started. And that is baked into these organizations' DNA. And it's not a bad thing. It's serving the public good by getting you the information that you need faster. Live television changed that. That was sort of the first blow. The internet changed dramatically. And, you'll look at stories now where publishers, including the ones we're talking about at the top, UPI, AP, New York Times, highly respected publishers will make 3, 4, 5 changes to their web stories because they can. And so you look at how do we get facts out faster? We'll just put something up there and we'll correct it later on, is the direction that we're going. But you still have this DNA of we have to beat the New York Times, we have to beat the Washington Post, we have to beat AP. And I'm fascinated by the direction of getting everybody to come together. But we're going to have these publishers forget who they were.
Yeah, or figure out where you can collaborate and where you can't, and what is it that is important for us to do. So I would say standards around indexing and provenance, That's what we need. We need combinations, right? So we need publishers of the world to come together and go, okay, what can we all do technologically underneath this that will allow downstream users to make an informed judgment about, has this been tampered with or not, right? Is this a deep fake or is it real? That, I think, would be a shared interest in it. Getting everybody to the table is never easy, but I can't see how you could argue that their interests are not aligned in having that, at least that standard done. So I want to see that happen. But this next layer, I think, is really hard, and yet I think it's possible. And it in some respects, it goes to your business model, where the real value of the information that is being ingested and absorbed and then republished by Turbine Labs is not how many likes or hits or follows or emotional dopamine releases it is released, but what is its impact and what is its relevance to a particular decision maker's questioning, right? And at the heart of desire to be that person, I don't want to be driven by clicks. I want to know that what I wrote impacted, that it mattered. Any J school is going to tell you that change the world stories, and then of course they end up like writing clickbait stories about the Kardashians. So that's a really interesting idea that we could now, through these new tools, actually put a value on impact, right? And then the question is, okay, so that's you as the journalistic, you're being rewarded and remunerated for that purpose. That's a good thing. But again, how do we still that from, how does the New York Times and Post? And that's where I think, this is where I do think, provenance solutions can become quite useful. The way that Streambet is building its model is to think about what we're calling a reverb score, so that you can look at a piece of content or look at a publisher and see where all of its interactions have gone and recognize what that influence was. If you could bake into a model something would say, and here's the impact that it had, right? Here's its reach. Then you could sort of build, to currency within something like the Turbine Labs model. You could actually highlight the impact that the New York Times had, the relevance that it had within this other world. There could be data that you could extract from that. So I'm really interested in solutions that look to the complexity of how people engage with information and act with it. And can we use a lot of this new architecture to build stories, information stories that then highlight quality journalism and actually have mechanisms within them to reward those who produce that journalism, as opposed to something that is motivated by clicks and disinformation and algorithmic stuff that I think is really, really harmful.
Well, just to conclude, Michael, with the amount of time that you spent at Turner and at CNN and Michael Casey, with your career of 18 years at the Wall Street Journal, I also think that the solutions are going to come from those who understand the importance of the words that they're writing. And we lost some of that. The publisher model, which became advertising model and search, and what's going to make Google or Facebook happy. Journalists just want to tell stories and convey facts, and it's going to be a bottoms up approach to solve the problem. So, Sarah, I'm going to hand it back to you, knowing we have just a little bit of time left. Discussion, by the way.
It absolutely is, and I view this as not just a live stream today, but it felt more like a master class or a master's level educational moment where we're really digging into a topic, and it requires much more than an hour. And I think this is a great starting point. So how do we jump off and continue? And for any of those watching, feel free to reach out with questions, offer solutions, start the dialogue in other places, continue what we're talking about today. I want to thank Lee, Michael, and Michael for your time and expertise. I know many of us are in the days of back-to-back Zoom calls or live streams, so thank you for your time, attention. And I wonder if Michael just lost his internet connection, which would be very serendipitous.
No, I think he just went to the next Zoom.
Oh, see, that's just what happens.
Well, Sarah, as always, thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you.
See you, Michael. As
Please.
always. Yeah, thanks so much for everyone for taking the time today.